Someone once said that a legacy is etched into the minds of others in the stories they share about you. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is often remembered as just a major civil rights activist. However, he was passionate about many other arising issues in the 1960s, such as labor rights, economic justice, and the Vietnam War. All of King's views on these issues left a powerful effect on American citizens. Martin Luther King Jr. was born on January 15, 1929, to Michael King Sr. and Alberta Williams King. His father and grandfather were both ministers. He attended Morehouse College at age 15. King was an outstanding student, vintage valedictorian of his class, and student body president. He decided to follow in his family's footsteps after college and become a pastor. He also earned his Ph.D. in 1955. Later, King became the leader of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. pursued three main issues that all connected together: economic justice, labor rights, and the Vietnam War. All these ideas were presented to the world on April 3, 1968 in the Mason Temple in Memphis, Tennessee, in which many say is one of King's most powerful speeches, the I've Been to the Mountaintop speech. The title references Moses climbing up the mountain, reaching the top, and looking over towards the Promised Land. King does the same when he used his religious background to help the nation to view issues from a different perspective, a perspective that could only be viewed by climbing up the mountain and looking back at things in retrospect. He took a step back and looked at the nation's issues in 1968. He said that, quote, "the nation is sick, trouble is in the land, confusion all around." But he goes on to say that, quote, "only when it is dark enough you can see the stars." This gave the people hope. The speech was for the purpose of the sanitation workers' strike early in 1968 in Memphis, Tennessee. It all began when two sanitation workers were crushed by a malfunctioning garbage truck on February 1st. Then, Mayor Loeb refused to buy new trucks and take the malfunctioning ones out of service. He refused to pay workers fair wages, and many of the workers were on welfare and relied on food stamps. King asked God for permission to time travel to Egypt and said he wanted to, quote, "watch God's children in their magnificent trek from the dark dungeons of Egypt through, or rather across the Red Sea through the wilderness on toward the Promised Land." Then he took a step back and looked at his nation's issues in 1968, the fight for labor unions, economic justice, and the Vietnam War. On February 11th, 700 people began a strike with an approved resolution from the NAACP. However, on February 24th, police used mace and tear gas on nonviolent strikers. When King arrived and almost 1,300 people had joined the strike, he gave the famous mountaintop speech on April 3rd. He encouraged the workers to, quote, "march again in order to put the issue where it is supposed to be." He said, "We just need to go around to these stores and to these massive industries in our countries, and that our agenda calls for withdrawing economic support from you." King tells the people to stop buying from companies that do not give fair jobs to black workers, to put their monies in banks and get insurance from companies that are fair to black people. Although the speech was in the audience of the sanitation workers, it went beyond just the workers and stated more of King's famous ideas. He then continues his speech to the topic of war. He explains that, quote, "men for years now have been talking about war and peace. But now no longer can they just talk about it. It is no longer a choice between violence and nonviolence in this world. It's nonviolence or non-existence. That is where we are today." King's whole campaign is based on nonviolence, which is why he was against the Vietnamese War. On April 4th, 1967, a year prior to the mountaintop speech, King spoke out against the Vietnam War in front of 3,000 people at Riverside Church in New York City in a speech titled Beyond Vietnam. He explains why war is bad by stating that our government is, quote, "using massive doses of violence to solve its problems, to bring about the changes it wanted." He also claims that before the war, there was hope for all people in poverty. The nation had the money to pay attention. And that, quote, "I was increasingly compelled to see the war as an enemy of the poor and to attack it as such." This was because the nation was putting all their efforts and money into the war. King ends his speech with the words, "Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will, and He's allowed me to go up to the mountain, and I've looked over, and I've seen the Promised Land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as people will get to the Promised Land." Perhaps the reason for this statement was because King knew about the $50,000 reward for his death, or the possible bomb that could have been on his plane to Memphis, or the numerous threats against him. For later that day, on April 3rd, 1968, only a few hours after the "I've Been to the Mountaintop" speech, he was assassinated on the balcony of his motel. Perhaps Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. knew that his work would carry on for decades, that he had influenced many lives and impacted the nation as a whole.